All right, welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a genuinely massive transformation. I want you to picture something. Imagine the towering, snow-capped peaks of the Himalayas somehow visually blending right into the skyline of Paris. Or picture a bustling European street where Nepali, English, and French cultures are just seamlessly intersecting. If you've been keeping up with the news at all, you know Europe is standing at a profound crossroads right now. But look, we're not here to just rehash fleeting political headlines. We're going to unpack the deep, structural shifts happening right beneath the continent's surface. We're talking historical identity, incredibly complex economic realities, and a mathematically unforgiving demographic winter. It is an absolutely fascinating, multifaceted puzzle. So let's get into it.
And that brings us straight to the central question we'll be exploring today. Is Europe actually losing its cultural identity? Or is it just undergoing a painful yet entirely necessary modernization? We're going to look at this completely impartially. Because honestly, depending on which data you're looking at, this is either a profound sociological crisis of meaning, or it's the chaotic birth of a dynamic post-national future. Okay, to really wrap our heads around this, let's dive into a powerful metaphor. Imagine a breathtaking, centuries-old Gothic cathedral right in the heart of Paris. Maybe it's standing just a couple of miles from the Eiffel Tower. Now imagine all the pews have been ripped out and it's been converted into a highly efficient, perfectly secular transit hub. You've got millions of people passing through every single day, snapping photos, enjoying the smooth infrastructure, but no one stops to pray. No one shares a collective sense of what the space actually means. This perfectly captures the tension between a historical identity built on shared moral duties versus a modern identity that functions purely on secular, legal entitlements and human rights. To understand the sheer magnitude of this shift, we kind of have to look back at what European civilization was actually built upon. Historically, it rested on three indispensable pillars: Greek philosophy for intellectual inquiry, Roman law for civic structure, and Christianity for its moral and cosmological architecture. But, as several legal scholars have pointed out, there has been a very deliberate pivot away from this over the last few decades. A prime example? The 2003 drafting of the European Union Constitution. The drafters deliberately omitted any reference whatsoever to Europe's Christian roots, opting instead for a flatter, more technocratic language of human rights. Now, for many people, this secularization didn't just update European institutions. It created what they see as a dangerous spiritual vacuum. The famous sociologist Max Weber actually warned us about this. He called it the disenchantment of the world. The idea is, when you strip away the sacred, that overarching framework giving human striving its inherent meaning just vanishes. Think about it. Human rights are great at telling you what the state owes you, but they don't really offer any narrative about what you owe your neighbor. On the flip side, though, the other side of this debate looks at this exact same phenomenon and calls it rooted cosmopolitanism. They frame this shift not as some tragic loss, but as a necessary evolution. It's this really interesting idea that you can be deeply proud of your native Nepali or English heritage, deeply anchored in your local traditions, while simultaneously walking the streets of Paris and embracing a broader, shared, transnational European identity based on democratic governance. From this viewpoint, culture is a living, breathing organism. It has to adapt to a globalized world, transitioning from insular nation-states into these dynamic, hybrid entities. So what does the data actually say? Well, data from the European Value Study reveals that these cultural dividing lines haven't just disappeared into thin air. They've actually structurally shifted. Pre-2008, we had a religious versus secular divide that was hyper-focused on moral traditionalism and the family. But today, that's completely changed. Today's major societal cleavage essentially pits authoritarianism against libertarianism. It divides people along lines of education and geography over highly secular issues, things like immigration, globalization, and deindustrialization. Okay, but we really can't talk about cultural identity without pivoting to the cold, hard, mathematical reality that is threatening the very foundation of the European state. We are talking about the demographic winter. Here's the deal. The modern European welfare state basically operates as a pay-as-you-go pipeline, meaning today's workers directly fund today's retirees. And right now, there is a massive, looming structural deficit of actual human beings entering that pipeline. And the scale of this shift is just staggering. According to the European Commission's 2024 Aging Report, the European labor pool is projected to plummet by 12% by the year 2070. That is 25 million workers simply vanishing from the labor force, literally just gone. Naturally, this inevitably builds into a full-blown economic crisis, because while that labor force is shrinking, the total cost of aging, we're talking pensions, healthcare, and long-term care, is projected to rise to the point where it consumes an astounding 25.6% of Europe's entire GDP. So the million-dollar question becomes, how on earth can a drastically shrinking labor pipeline possibly fund the exploding costs of an aging society? The math just doesn't seem to work out.
To solve this, economists generally point to two fiercely debated solutions. The first is replacement migration. To put that in perspective, the UN estimates Europe would need a staggering 12.7 million migrants every single year just to mathematically maintain their current worker-to-retiree ratio. The alternative to that is aggressive industrial automation. This means massively upgrading manufacturing and agriculture with robotics. The goal here would be to free up the native workforce for high-empathy roles, like elderly care, and essentially break the reliance on cheap foreign labor.
Now, there is another proposed solution, and it involves completely redefining what it even means to be working age. Instead of defining old age by a static number, like 65, demographers are proposing something called prospective age. This defines old age as having 15 years of remaining life expectancy. It's a neat trick because if we adjust our expectations on paper, the dependency ratios balance out much, much smoother. But obviously, the friction here is purely physical. You can't realistically ask a 68-year-old to safely climb a wind turbine or to physically lift a dementia patient out of bed. On the other hand, if Europe decides to rely heavily on replacement migration, that brings its own immense material friction, particularly for the native working class. Take housing, for example. In England, housing analysis have shown that 89% of the rise in the housing deficit over the last decade was driven by net migration. It's just a logistical reality. You cannot inject millions of people into a system without putting intense physical strain on local infrastructure and consequently social solidarity. And this physical strain fundamentally alters public perception in a huge way. There's some really fascinating research from the Isaac Institute of Labor Economics on this. They found that while migration inflows did not actually increase long-term property crime victimization rates, they did drastically and measurably increase the fear of crime among native populations. And of course, that fear is heavily amplified by media distortion and political feedback loops. That said, localized crime spikes absolutely do happen, and economics can actually explain exactly why. If we apply Gary Becker's opportunity cost theory, studies show that when bureaucratic frameworks fail, like for example when asylum seekers are legally barred from entering the legitimate labor market while their claims are being processed, the opportunity cost of illegal activity literally drops to zero. They are structurally pushed into the underground economy simply to survive, which inadvertently drives up localized property crime. However, the friction that native citizens are feeling isn't just physical fear or even economic anxiety over housing and jobs. Sociologists call this loss of shared community trust a threat to ontological safety. That's a fancy term for the security of your identity and meaning. It's that disorienting feeling of watching your cultural landscape change so rapidly, of seeing totally new global faces and customs on those familiar Parisian streets we talked about earlier, that the unspoken kinship required to maintain a high-trust welfare state actually begins to fracture. And this brings us right back to our cathedral metaphor from the beginning. Some analysts argue that secular European societies, which remember lean heavily on relativistic tolerance and individualism, really struggle to integrate immigrant communities who arrive with incredibly robust, living, moral, and religious frameworks. The core argument here is that you can't ask a society that fundamentally leans away from absolute truths to successfully integrate millions of people who deeply believe in something rigid. The result, they argue, is a profound societal hollowing out.
Finally, we have to take a hard look at the geopolitical reality, because this internal friction is a massive vulnerability. We are actively seeing third-party states, like Belarus, explicitly weaponizing migration. They're funneling migrants across borders specifically to exploit Europe's internal political panic. Add to that the radicalization of marginalized native-born generations in underfunded suburbs, and a completely paralyzed, fragmented EU institutional response. Put it all together, and you have a continent under severe, unprecedented structural strain.
So ultimately, we are left having to ask some pretty heavy questions. Is Europe merely a massive economic zone optimized for GDP? Or is it a historical community with a shared cultural destiny? Can you fund hospitals and pensions with cultural confidence alone? No, you can't. But at the same time, can you just swap out a continent's population to balance a spreadsheet and realistically expect its social trust to hold? I want to leave you with this one final thought to consider. What truly constitutes the foundation of a civilization? The secular efficiency of the transit hub or the shared sacredness of the space? Thanks for joining us for this explainer. We'll see you next time.